Everything had been rehearsed: the doors, the footsteps, even the distance between each royal. But moments before the procession began, Catherine discovered exactly where she had been placed. She said almost nothing. She simply stopped. And suddenly, one carefully arranged royal order was in danger of collapsing. In this dramatized telling, the problem was not where Catherine stood, but what that position appeared to say. Royal processions are built on details so precise they can look meaningless from the outside. Who enters first? Who follows whom? How much distance separates one rank from another? Yet inside the monarchy, those details can carry the weight of authority, loyalty, and succession. Catherine had walked through enough ceremonies to understand that nothing about the order was accidental. She had expected the usual instructions, the familiar sequence, the quiet discipline required before a major royal appearance. Then she saw the final arrangement. Camilla would walk directly ahead of her. For a moment, Catherine said nothing. An aide moved toward her, apparently believing there had been some minor confusion. Perhaps she had misread the instruction. Perhaps someone had pointed her toward the wrong place. But Catherine did not step forward. Her response was calm, almost unnervingly so. There was no raised voice, no public argument, no emotional display that could be carried beyond the small circle standing nearby. She simply refused to take the position. That refusal changed the atmosphere immediately. Because Catherine's objection, as she framed it, was not about refusing respect to Camilla. It was about symbolism. Walking directly behind the Queen in that particular formation could be dismissed as ordinary protocol, but Catherine believed it carried another message, one involving William, herself, and the monarchy waiting beyond Charles's reign. That was what made the moment dangerous. Several steps ahead, Camilla appeared unaware that anything had gone wrong. The procession was still moments from beginning. Guests were waiting. Timings had been fixed. Senior staff began exchanging increasingly urgent words, because the entire formation depended on each person moving when expected. One hesitation could be corrected. A deliberate refusal could not. And Catherine was not moving. What troubled the aides most was the certainty behind her decision. This was not a reaction made in anger. She seemed to know exactly why the placement mattered. Somewhere beneath the printed order lay another understanding, older, quieter, and never formally announced, that certain ceremonial arrangements should not be allowed to blur the distinction between the monarchy's present authority and its future succession. Farther ahead, Charles noticed the delay. He turned just enough to understand that the procession had stalled, and when his attention settled on Catherine's unmoving position, the seriousness of the problem became clear. He knew there was almost no time left. He also knew that forcing the issue could transform a private disagreement into something impossible to hide. Charles now had seconds to choose between enforcing the arrangement and protecting the illusion of unity, but what Catherine quietly told the nearest aide made the problem far more dangerous than a misplaced position. Catherine's objection was not about walking several feet behind another woman. According to the logic governing that private moment, it was about something far larger, whether ceremonial precedents could quietly redefine the future, and Catherine believed accepting the position once might make it impossible to challenge later. That was the danger Catherine seemed to understand before anyone else around her was willing to say it aloud. Inside royal life, symbolism can harden into precedent with astonishing speed. A single arrangement appears once, then again. Soon, what began as a practical decision starts to look traditional. And once tradition is claimed, challenging it becomes far more difficult. Catherine knew that the monarchy often speaks most loudly through things that are never formally explained. Official rank was one thing. Ceremonial choreography was another. the public might see a procession as a sequence of people walking through a doorway, but inside the institution, every step could suggest who stood closest to power, who represented continuity, and who was expected to wait their turn. To Catherine, being placed directly behind Camilla carried a meaning beyond simple courtesy. It risked presenting the future princess-to-queen transition as permanently subordinate to Camilla's present authority. And this time, William was not beside her. There was no husband stepping forward to object, no protective intervention she could lean on, no opportunity to let someone else take responsibility. Catherine had to decide for herself whether to accept the order or quietly resist it. That made her refusal more revealing. It was not borrowed defiance. It was hers. A senior courtier moved closer and reminded her, in careful language, that guests were already waiting. The procession could not be held indefinitely. Any unexplained pause might attract attention. The message was obvious. Whatever Catherine believed, there were easier ways to discuss it later. But Catherine did not move. Her answer was measured. Avoiding embarrassment, she indicated, could not justify accepting a symbol she believed crossed a line. The calmness unsettled those around her more than anger would have. Catherine had spent years learning the discipline of royal life, following instructions, respecting rank, absorbing discomfort without allowing it to become spectacle. For someone so practiced in obedience to stop at precisely this moment suggested she believed the stakes were far greater than a temporary inconvenience. Then another question surfaced. Who had actually approved the revised order? Some assumed it must have come from Charles. Yet the closer aides looked, the less certain that became. The change appeared to have moved through layers of protocol and household planning without a clear royal instruction attached to it. Suddenly the disagreement was no longer simply Catherine versus Camilla. Someone, somewhere inside the machinery of the palace, had altered a sensitive piece of ceremonial positioning and allowed it to reach the final moments without explanation. That question reached Charles almost immediately, and when he saw the amended order for himself, his reaction suggested Catherine was not the only person who had been kept in the dark. There was no time for meetings, explanations, or palace diplomacy. Charles had only moments before the doors were due to open. One wrong decision could embarrass Camilla, alienate Catherine, involve William, and leave photographers capturing a fracture the palace might spend months trying to explain. Charles moved away from his expected place just long enough to speak with the official responsible for coordinating the procession. His manner was controlled, but the urgency underneath it was unmistakable. He did not go directly to Catherine. He did not challenge her in front of the surrounding aides. More importantly, he did not order her into position. Charles understood that forcing the issue could turn a silent disagreement into a visible act of defiance, and once that happened, there would be no easy way to contain it. His first question was simple: who changed the order? The answer only deepened the problem. The revised sequence, he was told, had apparently emerged through household-level protocol discussions rather than from one clear instruction issued by Charles himself. That distinction mattered. It meant Catherine may have been resisting an arrangement that neither the king nor the queen had personally demanded. A decision made somewhere inside the machinery of the palace had suddenly placed 4 senior royals on the edge of an unnecessary confrontation. Charles reacted quickly. Instead of deciding that Catherine must surrender or that Camilla must be visibly moved aside, he changed the structure around them. Other members of the procession were repositioned. Small adjustments were made to the sequence. The direct image of Catherine walking immediately behind Camilla disappeared, yet nothing about the revised formation openly suggested that anyone had been demoted. It was an elegant solution to an ugly problem. Catherine accepted the new position without triumph. There was no smile of victory, no gesture suggesting she had won a private battle. She simply prepared to move. That restraint mattered because it revealed what she had wanted all along. Not Camilla's humiliation, but the removal of a symbol she believed could become precedent. Charles made another calculation just as important. He chose not to explain everything to Camilla before the procession began. There was no time, and telling her that Catherine had specifically objected to walking behind her risked creating a second confrontation when the first had barely been contained. Charles appeared to decide that silence, at least for those final seconds, was safer than complete honesty. Then the doors opened. The procession moved exactly when it was supposed to. To the outside world, there was no crisis, no hesitation, no sign that the royal order had been rewritten at the last possible moment. The ceremony appeared seamless. Only a small group inside the palace understood how close that polished display had come to breaking apart. And Charles knew the danger had not vanished. He had only moved it out of sight. The ceremony had been saved, but Charles had merely hidden the disagreement, not solved it. And once Camilla learned why the procession had been changed, the silence inside the palace became considerably harder to maintain. Camilla did not discover the truth while cameras were watching. She learned afterward, when the ceremony was already being praised as another display of royal unity. The revelation changed everything. Catherine had not missed her place. She had consciously refused it, and Charles had quietly accommodated her decision. Until that moment, Camilla had assumed the alteration was practical. Royal ceremonies were always vulnerable to last-minute changes. A delay here, a repositioning there, a subtle adjustment to keep the entire machine moving. There had been no reason for her to believe this change was different, but once someone within her household explained what had happened, the meaning shifted instantly. Catherine had objected to walking directly behind her. To Camilla, that was not a minor detail. It touched the very question Catherine had been trying to avoid, but from the opposite direction. Camilla saw the placement as a reflection of the present. She was queen now. Whatever the future might hold for William and Catherine, the current reign still had its own order, its own authority, its own expectations. From her perspective, the arrangement had not diminished Catherine at all. It had simply acknowledged the hierarchy that existed in that moment, and that was where the conflict became dangerous. Both women could believe they were protecting the monarchy. Catherine saw herself resisting a symbol that might weaken the future. Camilla saw herself defending the legitimacy of the present. Neither position was easy to dismiss, and that made the dispute harder to solve than a simple clash of personalities. But what unsettled Camilla most was not Catherine's refusal. It was Charles's response. He had changed the arrangement without first telling her why. Camilla understood the pressure he had been under, but understanding did not remove the sting. To her, the decision raised an uncomfortable question. When forced to choose quickly between preserving her dignity and protecting Catherine from a symbolic slight, had Charles already revealed where his instincts now lay? Charles insisted there had been no real choice. The procession had been seconds from beginning. Any confrontation could have created a public embarrassment far greater than the disagreement itself. He had acted to protect everyone. Camilla heard the reasoning, but the emotional wound remained. Because beneath the argument was a truth no one could comfortably escape. Camilla's authority belonged to the present reign. Catherine's influence, however, grew from something harder to contain: the future. Every year, every ceremony, every appearance brought that future closer. Publicly, nothing changed. Catherine remained composed. Camilla remained gracious. Their courtesy gave no indication that anything had shifted. But privately, trust had become more cautious, and every ceremonial detail now carried greater weight than before. Worse still, another unresolved question of royal symbolism was already waiting. What appeared to be a dispute over several footsteps was now becoming a struggle over something far harder to divide. Who controls the symbols of the monarchy when the present queen and the future queen occupy the same room? Behind palace doors, the argument became less about Catherine and Camilla personally, and more about an uncomfortable institutional question. Should the monarchy organize itself around the sovereign's present reign? Or should it begin protecting the authority of the couple destined to inherit everything that comes afterward? In this dramatized account, that question did not produce an open rebellion. There were no formal camps, no declarations, no dramatic lines drawn across palace corridors. But the difference in thinking was there. Some senior advisors believed Charles and Camilla's authority had to remain unquestioned for as long as Charles wore the crown. Others had begun looking further ahead, arguing quietly that William and Catherine could not repeatedly be placed in positions that weakened the symbolism of their eventual succession. Nobody called them factions. Nobody needed to. From that point forward, even small household decisions began attracting sharper attention. Seating plans, entrance orders, ceremonial pairings, and private instructions were no longer treated as harmless details. Catherine, especially, became more careful. The procession had taught her that seemingly minor arrangements could carry consequences long after an event ended. She was no longer willing to assume that every instruction arriving from the machinery of the palace was politically neutral. Then William learned exactly what had happened. His concern was not simply that Catherine had refused to walk behind Camilla. In fact, he understood why she had hesitated. What disturbed him was that such a sensitive change had reached the final moments before a major ceremony without being properly discussed. To William, that suggested a deeper problem. Decisions affecting the future king and queen could still move through the system without their knowledge. Privately, he stood behind Catherine. Publicly, he did not rush into confrontation with Charles. That restraint mattered. William knew that turning a ceremonial disagreement into a father and son struggle would only deepen the fracture. Yet his silence was not surrender. It was calculation. Charles sensed the danger too. He feared that one disputed procession could become the beginning of competing royal households, each guarding its own authority, symbolism, and future. Camilla felt the pressure from another direction. She increasingly seemed cast as the obstacle between the monarchy that existed and the monarchy waiting to replace it, a role she had never asked to play. So the palace began reviewing future ceremonies more carefully. Every overlap between Camilla and Catherine was examined before it could become another last-minute crisis. And during that review, advisors found something far more sensitive. An approaching event placed both women inside the same symbolic territory again. But this time, there would be no footsteps to rearrange, no formation to quietly alter, no easy way to hide the disagreement. The procession might have disappeared from public view, but the next confrontation could not be rearranged with a few whispered instructions, because this time the disputed symbol would be worn in plain sight. Inside the royal collection, jewels are never merely decoration. A tiara can carry a dead queen's memory. A necklace can suggest succession. And when preparations began for the next major appearance, one proposed piece threatened to reopen the procession dispute in a form nobody could quietly rearrange before the doors opened. The next royal occasion was supposed to restore calm. Catherine and Camilla would appear together again, this time under circumstances where every detail had already been reviewed more carefully than before. Yet the closer the households came to finalizing preparations, the more obvious it became that the procession crisis had changed everything. Nothing could now be treated as neutral. Not an entrance, not a seat, and certainly not a jewel. The disputed piece carried history with it. It had passed through generations and, in the language of monarchy, suggested continuity almost without explanation. That was precisely why it became so sensitive. To one household, its use by Camilla was entirely natural. She was the reigning queen, and the symbol belonged to the present crown. To another, the jewel represented something broader, something connected to inheritance and the future line. Catherine's advisors became cautious immediately. They feared that allowing another symbolic choice to pass without discussion could recreate the same problem as the procession, only this time in a form the public would notice. Catherine herself had already learned what silence could cost. She did not want another apparently minor decision becoming an accepted statement about where the future queen stood. Camilla saw the issue differently. To her, the suggestion that she should avoid certain royal symbols simply because Catherine might wear them one day carried an insult of its own. She was not borrowing the role. She occupied it. Why should the reigning queen behave as though her position were provisional, simply to protect the feelings surrounding a future reign? That question landed heavily with Charles. He could now see that the problem had grown far beyond one ceremony. Every photograph could be interpreted through succession. Every jewel could be treated as a declaration. Every seating plan could be read as evidence of who mattered more. The institution had entered dangerous territory where ordinary royal choices were becoming tests of loyalty. William privately made his position clear. Catherine could not spend years giving away symbolic ground, merely because challenging it created discomfort. If every difficult question were postponed, he warned, the future would always be expected to surrender to the present. But Charles understood the other side just as sharply. Camilla could not be asked to live as a temporary queen. That would weaken his own reign as much as it would wound her personally. The jewel had exposed what the procession only hinted at. Two eras were beginning to overlap, and neither could be allowed to erase the other. Charles could no longer solve each confrontation seconds before it became visible. If the monarchy was going to avoid repeating the procession crisis, he would need to establish rules nobody had wanted to write down. The most important conversation did not happen in a corridor or during another ceremony. It happened privately, away from uniforms, jewels, and waiting cameras. Charles now faced three people closest to the monarchy's future and had to define boundaries that tradition had deliberately left vague for generations. The purpose of the meeting was simple in theory and difficult in practice. Stop ceremonial disagreements from becoming personal wounds. Charles understood that the procession had exposed a weakness inside the system. Catherine should never have discovered such a sensitive change at the final moment, and he acknowledged that plainly. Whatever the intention behind the altered order, the process had failed. He accepted responsibility for allowing palace machinery to create a confrontation that should have been prevented long before anyone was expected to take their place. Catherine answered with the same restraint that had defined her refusal. She made clear that she had never intended to humiliate Camilla. Her concern had been consistency. If she accepted the arrangement once, future objections could be dismissed with a simple question. Why challenge it now when you accepted it before? To Catherine, silence would not have preserved harmony. It would only have postponed the conflict while making her position weaker. Camilla, however, had her own truth to deliver. She did not want to be treated like a ceremonial obstacle inside her husband's reign. Every time a symbol was questioned, because Catherine would one day be queen, Camilla felt as though her own position was being quietly reduced before the reign had even ended. That carried humiliation of its own. Then William finally spoke without restraint. Catherine, he argued, could not continually be placed in situations where protecting family peace required her to surrender ground connected to their future responsibilities. If the monarchy expected discipline from her, it also owed her clarity. She should not have to discover the boundaries only when she crossed them. Charles now faced the heart of the problem. He established a principle that neither side could easily claim as victory. Camilla's standing as queen would be fully respected. But ceremonial arrangements would not be used unnecessarily to place William and Catherine in positions that could be interpreted as diminishing their future role. Ambiguous questions of precedence would be discussed between households before events, not imposed in the final minutes. The same approach extended to jewels and other powerful symbols. Certain pieces, appearances, and ceremonial choices would receive clearer boundaries so that tradition could no longer be interpreted differently depending on which household was speaking. It solved the immediate problem. It did not erase the damage. The four of them now understood one another differently. Catherine had shown that she would resist. Camilla had shown that she would defend her present authority. William had made clear that he would no longer remain entirely outside these disputes, and Charles had learned that silence was no longer enough to hold two royal eras together. The palace now had its rules, but rules could not undo the moment Catherine stopped walking. Nor could they erase what Charles had learned when she forced the monarchy to confront a question it had been postponing. To everyone outside the palace, nothing had happened. The procession began. The royals smiled. The ceremony continued. But inside the institution, those missing few seconds became impossible to forget. Because Catherine had demonstrated something far more significant than disobedience. She was prepared to defend the meaning of her future position herself. That was what made the moment linger. Publicly, the ceremony had unfolded with the kind of control the monarchy depends on. There was no visible rupture, no awkward pause, no sign that anything had come close to going wrong. Yet behind that polished surface, the balance had shifted. Catherine was no longer seen simply as someone who had mastered the discipline of royal life. She had shown that she was willing to question the interpretation of that discipline when she believed it touched the future of the crown. That distinction mattered. Obedience had helped her survive the institution. Judgment would define how she eventually helped lead it. Charles had changed too. His intervention revealed the pressure at the heart of his reign. He had to protect Camilla's dignity in the present while knowing that the monarchy's future belonged to William and Catherine. Every decision carried both realities at once, and the procession had forced him to recognize that he could no longer rely on silence and custom to keep those two worlds from colliding. Camilla did not emerge as a defeated figure. Her position was more complicated than that. She had been forced to confront one of monarchy's harshest truths. Every reign contains the knowledge of what comes after it. Authority can be absolute in the present and still temporary in the larger story. William's later intervention deepened the shift. Catherine would no longer be left alone to choose between preserving family peace and protecting the meaning of their future role. That support changed the emotional balance inside the four-person relationship and made future disputes harder to dismiss as misunderstandings. The new boundaries reduced the immediate danger, but they also formalized something everyone had once preferred to leave unspoken. There was a reigning couple, and there was a future one. That distinction would now shape every ceremony differently. The procession, therefore, became more than a disagreement about order. It became an internal warning about how the smallest royal details could expose the largest questions: legitimacy, inheritance, loyalty, power, and the fear of being replaced. And therein lay the paradox. Monarchy depends on exact order. Everyone must know where to stand, when to move, and who walks before whom. Yet the entire institution survives only because everyone also understands that one day that order must change. Catherine's refusal mattered precisely because almost nobody saw it happen. The institution adjusted before the conflict reached the public, and the silence that protected the monarchy also revealed how much had nearly broken beneath it. And that may be the most revealing part of all. The monarchy's greatest battles are rarely the ones fought before the public. They are the ones settled seconds earlier, behind closed doors, before anyone outside the palace realizes there was ever something to hide.